So, can everyone see this? I've done this on this computer, right? So the Hawkesbury-Nepean Landcare Network is a community-based organisation. So Landcare is set up really, and my role here is to support, community groups and landholders, schools, and any conservation or land management projects they're interested in. So in the Hawkesbury, it tends to be conservation focused, but agriculture and sustainable farming is also a big aspect of Landcare in general. And my role in particular really is to support landholders, help groups kind of get up and running and get themselves going, and then pass people on information, be aware of opportunities and grants that are available to people as well. So we work with, so these are our groups. There's actually 1 or 2 new ones that I haven't put up there. So those are kind of the groups in the area. So I work, the Hawkesbury-Nepean Landcare Network covers Hawkesbury, Hills, Balcktown and Penrith. So it's a fairly big area. Hawkesbury dominates the number of groups it has, but that's not really surprising at the moment. But yeah, there is a lot of interest, and those are the groups we support, as well as working with councils and a few of the state bodies like local land services and the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, Hawkesbury County Council, who are the local weed authority for the 4 government areas, so managing priority weeds and inspecting private properties. They fund part of my role, so we work quite closely with them when they visit properties and identify anyone that'd be interested in land care. We work together with them, as well as working with kind of other broader projects throughout the country or the state, and making sure that they're kind of delivered in this area or tailored to the community in this area. So Land for Wildlife is one. Started on the Central Coast by the Community Environment Network, and we now have 3 regional providers in our area. So also doing a few projects with Ozfish and Western Sydney University. Actually, I haven't popped a newer one up there, not so new, but not more public now, which is the Hawkesbury-Nepean River Waterkeeper Alliance. So a report card was released about the health of the waterways that they've been monitoring the past few years. And that's kind of run by the Western Sydney Uni, but it's run by a kind of bunch of groups. Oh no, not that one. So I say this now because everyone drops off at the end. We're going to hear some really good stuff about, frogs and getting involved in citizen science and how that's valuable to the research. There are also other ways to get involved, such as helping out as a volunteer at general events that get run, as one-offs, joining a group or starting a local group, restoring or, doing vegetation on your own property. So if you're interested in that and you don't know where to start, please contact me. You'll have all my contact details in an email at the end. And look, if you're not sure what you want to do, or you don't live on a property, but you want to be involved, there's always different skills that are needed. It's not necessarily just on-ground work. There's a lot of background work that happens as well. And we always love the help if it's possible. So yeah, if you want to get involved, you're not sure how, just give me a call, have a chat, and you can become a member as well, which is free, but it keeps you, connected with updates and projects. Just a bit of housekeeping, we generally do. We are on a Zoom call, so please make sure that you have your microphone on mute. When we go through questions, you can pop them off mute to ask, that's fine. If you have questions throughout the presentation, I think Maureen will probably stop throughout, but if she's kind of mid-slide and you really got to get it out, just pop it in the chat and we'll keep a tab of the questions that are going. Videos are optional and all that. Chat is public, so if pop IDs in or things that you've heard about, that's fine. Just make sure it's a respectful space. And we have a few polls. We do this, doesn't matter how many people we have, but it's just to understand. We have one at the start, it's just like a little questionnaire, and one at the end, just to understand what where you're at, and then how helpful, and if you've got any feedback at the end of the webinar. Cool. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and while everyone goes through that, we'll get Maureen to share hers. So, share. Maureen, do you have enough to share yours?
Sure.
Yep.
It says a host disabled participant screen sharing. So maybe you have to make me a co-host.
I thought I'd done that.
I think if you click on my
Yeah.
picture on the gallery.
Make her host. Here you go. That should do it. Has that come through for you?
Yep.
Yep, easy. Cool.
And can you guys see my slide?
Yes.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, nice, loud and clear.
Perfect. So I introduced myself earlier, but in case you weren't here, my name is Maureen Thompsonn. I'm here to talk about FrogID. I am a member of the FrogID team and a PhD candidate at UNSW, using FrogID data to answer some basic questions about frog breeding ecology and to look at the human component, why people contribute and how they contribute changes the data that we have, and using that information to both improve the user experience and hopefully attract more people so we can get even better data about frog ecology. And I'm here with Nadia Roslin, who is the FrogID project coordinator. We're both passionate about citizen science, which is public participation and collaboration in scientific research with the aim to increase scientific knowledge. So the Australian Museum Research Institute has a long history of citizen science projects and currently manages with collaborators some of Australia's most well-known and well-loved citizen science programs. For example, DigiVol is an online digitization volunteer program where you can transcribe data from natural history collections. And we also have the Australasian Fishes Project, where you can upload, identify, and comment on observations of Australian and New Zealand fish, and investigate changes in growth, patterns, and shape. So we have several citizen science projects based at the Australian Museum, and FrogID is our flagship project. It was started in 2017. And our team at the Australian Museum established FrogID for several reasons. A big reason is that frogs are in a lot of trouble globally. There are hundreds of species thought to be extinct and many others threatened with extinction currently. And when people think of endangered animals, they might think of tigers and rhinoceroses and sort of large, iconic animals. But hopefully after today, more of us are thinking about frogs, because frogs are actually more threatened and declining more rapidly than some of these more famous mammal and bird groups. And in recent years, scientists have become increasingly aware of worldwide decline in numbers of frogs, and 42% of amphibians are threatened with extinction. And they face a number of simultaneous threats. So frogs are experiencing their own fungal and viral disease pandemics. They're also suffering from habitat loss and degradation, pollution, competition from invasive species, removal from the wild through the wildlife trade, and of course, climate change. So those sounds like frog problems, but why should you care? Well, if you want to think about it in a utilitarian sense, we want frogs to be around because there are benefits to conserving them in the ecosystems that we depend on for advancing medical research. So frogs are bioindicators, meaning because they're inherently tied to water, they breed in water, they breathe through water. So slight changes in the environment can make it impossible for them to survive. They're cold-blooded ectotherms, so they're dependent on external sources of body heat. So they're the same temperature as the external environment, which means that they are intricately linked and adapted to specific conditions. And so when those conditions change, they can be severely affected. And that's how we sometimes know about changes to the environment. Even though frogs are tiny, they make up a huge part of the ecosystem. Frogs themselves eat a lot of invertebrates, some of which are pests. So again, that's a service to us. And they also are eaten by a lot of other animals in the food web, like birds and snakes. So they keep those animals alive. Their tadpoles eat algae, which helps keep our streams clean. And so if we lose frogs, it changes everything in the ecosystem, and we lose the important roles they play in keeping our environment healthy. Another reason to care about frogs is for our own benefit. We're increasingly using secretions and chemicals that frogs produce in their skin, like antibacterial and antifungals in our own medicines. And almost all of Australian frog species are found nowhere else in the world. So if we lose them here, they're gone for good. And so they're really unique and special to this country. So frogs are in trouble and they're very important, but one of the biggest obstacles to frog conservation is our lack of knowledge. We really don't know much about them, and so that's another reason we created FrogID. So this is a graph of the known frog species we have in Australia over time. And even though I just mentioned all of this stuff about, threatened species and species disappearing, you can see we're also simultaneously still discovering new species. And we still have so much more to understand about each of them. So for example, the southern heath frog was just described in 2020. It was previously grouped in with the northern heath frog, but research by the University of Newcastle, South Australian Museum, and the Australian Museum showed that populations in the South Sydney Basin differ from the more northern populations due to their genetics, their morphology, and their advertisement call, something that we know from FrogID. And so after a few more species changes last year, we've changed the count of native frog species in Australia from 240 to 248. So that's pretty exciting, and it underscores that we still have so much more to learn about Australian frogs, and that FrogID plays a part in that. So in any area that you might be standing, there can be between 10 and 40 species of frogs in the general area around you. And this is a map of all the frog records across Australia from the Atlas of Living Australia. And what you can see is that there are large parts of Australia where, even though frogs are present, we don't have any scientific records of them. And that's a real problem when we want to decide things around land use and conservation. And even if we zoom in on New South Wales, which from this map, it looks like we've got it pretty well covered, at a finer scale, you can see that there are still so many places where we don't have any evidence of frogs. So back in 2017, when FrogID started, there had been around 500,000 records of frogs across Australia of all species for all time. And in the 4.5 years of FrogID's existence, we've collected over 660,000 records of frogs, so more than doubling the historic number. So we've come so far in such a short time, but there's still so much we don't know. So this lack of knowledge about frogs and the threats that they face is urgent, and to address it, we need people power. We need everyone to get out there and get the information that's necessary to help better understand our frogs. There's no way scientists can count Australia's frogs on their own, but with FrogID, citizen scientists like you and I can help put frogs on the map. So one pivotal aspect of FrogID's success is that Australian frogs make a distinctive call as an advertisement to breed. And this is true for all Australian frogs, but it's not true for all frogs in the world. So that's just another thing that makes this project so successful here. And that's really exciting to me. So the noise you hear in your backyard pond or local creek or dam when you hear a frog calling is the serenade of a male frog trying to attract a female frog. And because every species has a different sounding call, you can identify what species it is just by listening. And so to give you an idea of just how cryptic frog species can be by looks, here are two similar stream frogs and a visual representation of their calls in the waveform below them. So on the left, we have the Barrington Tops tree frog, which is found only in northern New South Wales from the New England tablelands to, of course, Barrington Tops area. And this is what this frog sounds like. I don't know if you can hear it. And then on the right, we have the green stream frog, which is more broadly distributed along the coast and ranges between Bellingham and Sydney. And that's what this one sounds like. A little bit more like laughter. So male frogs call to attract female frogs. And sometimes the call of the frog is the best way to identify them, but also you can identify them without disturbing the frog or their habitat. You don't need to go crawling through the bush to find them. You don't have to touch them. You don't have to get muddy. So it's like a really incredible survey method. So calls are really handy for species ID, and this helps the FrogID project because through calls, we can identify species really accurately. Like the two frogs in that picture before, I would have never known if I just saw one of them what species it was. So not only can we identify the species, but we also get so much more information from an audio sample. We can tell the breeding season, the breeding habitat, species diversity, if there are other frogs calling in the same recording, the number of frogs, and if there's call variability within and between species. And the last reason our team created FrogID is because we would be able to use the power of citizen science to collect data at large spatial and temporal scales. So by submitting FrogID recordings, you are contributing to a national study of Australia's frogs. The country is too big for scientists to do this without everyone. And so the FrogID app is really there for anyone to get out there and record frog calls for science. And this really would be impossible without citizen science. And we really need all this data across space and at this time to address these threats to frog survival. So FrogID is all of those things I mentioned, but it's also a free app for your smartphone where you can record and submit frog calls. It's also a frog field guide with you can see their calling periods, what they sound like. So much information. And so to give you an idea of what the experience of recording a call for FrogID is like, you're out in the bush, you hear a frog, something might be a frog, you open up your phone, you press the record button, and you start recording, and this audio, whatever you hear, is what's being recorded on your phone. And you want to record for at least 20 seconds, which is when that white line eclipses the red line, and you can record for up to 60 seconds. So we get, all the species that you hear around you. And of course, all of these calls are verified by an expert. It's not Shazam, there's not a bot. So you do have to wait to hear back from us, which can sometimes take a couple days to a few weeks, depending on how busy things are. And to give you an idea of what this looks like on the back end, the app automatically adds some metadata, like the date, the time, the location, the accuracy. And so this creates an expert verified data set of frog calls across the continent with so much important information for really using this for conservation planning and understanding our species. So the vast majority of records are unbuffered and made available to the public, again, through Atlas of Living Australia and GBIF on an annual basis. And we also have data license agreements in place with all state atlases including BioNet, for the provision of FrogID records with accurate locations of sensitive species records for their conservation and planning purposes. So this is really what brought me into the project and why I moved to Australia, because this data really is being used for research and conservation planning across the country. And that's just really rare and special for a citizen science project to be so integrated in making a difference in conservation planning and decision making. So just to look at some of FrogID's stats since it started, you can see it's getting more popular every year. You can also see there's a peak every summer and a drop every winter in recording activity. That's because most Australian frog species are really busy mating during November to January. But there's some species you can hear all year. So we've already had over 408,000 calls submitted, and that's led to 671,000 verified frogs, because of course there's more than one frog calling in a lot of recordings. And through FrogID, people have recorded 211 of the 248 known frog species in Australia. And we can even zoom in and look at some of our local stats. So here's me in Sydney and most of you in Hawkesbury. So we can see what's going on both with the frogs and the human element. So in Hawkesbury, there's over 350 unique FrogID users who have recorded around 20 species. And then in this right-hand panel of the lower box of Hawkesbury area, you can see what species are most common. So you can explore that data and get an idea of what you've heard, what you haven't heard, what to keep an ear out for. So the most commonly recorded species in Hawkesbury is also the most commonly recorded species in FrogID as a whole, and that's a common eastern froglet, Crinia signifera. Some people say it sounds like marbles rubbing together. Maybe you know it. And another one is the Perrin's tree frog, Litoria perroni. It's more like a loud, sort of expansive laugh. And this one was actually calling in the background of the last recording. I don't know if you heard it, but this is the eastern dwarf tree frog, Litoria phalax. Another one common in Hawkesbury. That it can sound, a lot of times people aren't sure if it's an insect or a frog. Sometimes they trick me too. And another one you might hear is the screaming tree frog. And this is actually another example of one that is new to science. It was just described as its own species last year. It was previously grouped in with the bleeding tree frog, but is now recognized that the southern population is a different species, the screaming tree frog. And it sounds just like a loud ma. So with all these contributors and all this frog data, what have we learned? Well, we're learning about disappearing frogs, threatened species, introduced species, and hitchhiking native species. So it's telling us important information about common or formerly common species. So FrogID provided the first information that the iconic Australian green tree frog, Litoria cerulea, had all but disappeared from the Sydney region. It used to be quite common, or so I'm told. I've only lived here a few years, but I've never heard it in Sydney. And we also get recordings of rare and threatened species. And another reason that call data is so valuable is it's not just that these rare species are passing through or spending a day somewhere, but it's information that the male deems this potential breeding habitat. And as we know, breeding is an essential part of species survival. So that's really important data to have. I know someone mentioned that they had learned about Cria sloanii, the Sloan's frog. We have over 900 records from the Victoria, New South Wales border area. And we also have 28 records of the Kuranda tree frog, a critically endangered species up in Queensland. And it's helping us track the invasion of the cane toad and respond to that really rapidly. And even native species that have been accidentally transported outside of their native range and established new foreign populations outside of that. So this dwarf tree frog, which we started hearing from users in Melbourne, is an example of that. And FrogID was instrumental in tracking the impact and recovery of frogs from the Black Summer bushfires. Thanks to thousands of people across the fire zone, we have about 1,200 users in New South Wales within the fire zone, and we received an incredible amount of recordings. And because FrogID users had already been collecting data before the fires, we had recorded data of 66 species. So we have a really good before and after impact data set, something that is normally unheard of and really hard to come by in large-scale wildlife research. So the bushfire crisis that gripped Australia was very real for people, and we truly hope that your communities are recovering well from these catastrophic events. But we're also hoping that frogs survived over the long term. Our team cannot get out there and do this alone, and we would really need data to keep going. Certainly, targeted surveys are ongoing and needed, but the amazing citizen science records really complement this work. And through FrogID, provide us with expert validated recordings of species. And species of high priority for this are species that had a large proportion of their range burnt. Those are the ones we're particularly worried about. But new FrogID results are building, and people are working on that information as we speak. So we had over 2,000 FrogID records before the burns, and we've had over 13,000 records after the burns. And we've recorded 62 of those 66 species within New South Wales burnt areas. So we have had some encouraging news. There are rare and threatened species that were documented calling post-fire, like the southern barred frog that was recorded calling in freshly burnt habitat, as well as the mountain frog, Phaloria kundagungan. We will not understand the full impact of these 2019-2020 bushfires until we're able to gather and analyze all of the fire event data. So not just frog calling, but evidence of habitat change and evidence of breeding success, not just breeding attempts. So these results are promising, but we still need more records to provide a more detailed understanding of the change and challenges to biodiversity over time. So panning back out, one of the greatest threats to global biodiversity is the modification of natural environments. As urban and agricultural areas expand, how do species respond? This information is lacking for a lot of threatened groups, including frogs. So Gracie Liu, another PhD candidate at UNSW and a member of the FrogID team, is using FrogID data to answer this question. So she developed a tolerance index to measure the effects on frogs of things like built-up areas, roads, farms, mines, and light pollution. And alarmingly, out of the 87 species she looked at, she found 70% were intolerant of human-modified habitats. So this really underscores how important it is to try and keep landscapes intact and how important it is to boost frog habitat. So if you're not already, I really encourage you to download the free FrogID app and register for a FrogID account, and then visit your local pond, wetland, creek, or bushland. Great times are in the evening or after rain. And record frog calls whenever you hear them. Maybe you hear them at home and you don't have to go anywhere. That's great too. And submit your FrogID records through the app, and we'll be glad to welcome you to the FrogID community and let you know what frogs we're calling in your recording. And you can also tell other people about FrogID. It really does spread through word of mouth and your contagious enthusiasm. So thank you so much for your time and attention. And I'm happy to stick around and chat and answer any questions.
Thanks, Maureen. Does anyone have any questions? It's interesting. I did hear, I don't know if anyone else had heard it last year when they distinguished the difference between the bleeding and the screaming tree frog right after Frog Week in November. I think it came out.
Wow, incredible memory.
It was like big news around here. Yeah, with the colleges trying to like, which one is it? Which one is it now? Like, which one do we call it? Hey, Alison, that's a fan.
Hi. I just have a quick question. We had some cane toad spot or a cane toad spotting occurred in Windsor Downs in the Hawkesbury area, which has concerned us significantly. I was wondering if you guys would be able to shed a bit of light on what sort of things are being done to try and address that, and what investigations are underway to try and find and eradicate any cane toads, and how we can help.
Nadia, do you want to answer? I'm actually not thinking about cane toads at all, so I would not be the one to answer.
I can have a go. Yep. So Maureen mentioned that we are collecting frog calls, even the introduced cane toad. And this is really helping us understand where cane toads are establishing and breeding populations all across Australia. And we provide this information to state wildlife atlases, but also government agencies working to manage cane toads on the invasion front. So on a regular basis, we provide these expert verified cane toad records to government agencies who are managing and understanding where cane toads are establishing. They are being transported in vehicles and sometimes not establishing breeding populations, which is great news, but they are occasionally being reported in our area. So it's a good idea if you suspect a cane toad is in your area and you're not too sure, because there are many native frog species out there that do look very similar to cane toads. It's a good idea to try and take a photo, and you can send it to us to just confirm that. And then if it is in an area where cane toads are not known to occur, they're not established yet, it's important to report that to DPI. In terms of things you can do to help boost native frog populations and control cane toads, there is a lot of research going around on management methods. Your local council or landcare group might have more information on what's approved in your area. We don't recommend killing cane toads just because many native frogs are being confused with the cane toad, and it's very difficult to remove them, but there might be other methods in your area. And you can also help boost native frog populations by providing or protecting habitat. So, a frog pond or frog hotel, providing some shelter and hiding spaces for native frogs, and also recording their calls with the FrogID app is obviously one way we're really understanding and monitoring their populations over time to see how they've been impacted by co-occurrence with cane toads that really compete with the resources that they want as well. Hope that answers all your questions, Alison.
It does. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Elias, you had your hand raised?
Hi, Maureen. How are you? Thanks for the talk. My question is, how does climate change cause issues for frogs in our society?
So many different ways. Because they breathe through their skin, they're really susceptible to a lot of things, and just like changes in the humidity change their susceptibility to these other diseases that they're already being impacted by. And climate change can also influence like how prevalent those diseases can be in the environment where they live and how they experience solar radiation. So really, there's just so many compounding effects that we already know frogs are sensitive to that are just really heightened through climate changes. And it's really depends, like there's a lot of differences in how like high elevation frogs are affected or, during different stages of life. It is really like a complicated issue that comes up in really nefarious different ways.
Okay. Also, has the green and golden bill frog been identified in Sydney in the past few years?
It's definitely at the Olympic Park. Have you been there?
No, not at all.
Well, that is a great place to go and hear them. They have a really like cool resonant call, and that's one holdout location where they do live in Sydney.
They're also at Riverstone Wetlands, but that's like a artificially constructed wetland that's an uncertain future, I think I would have to say, but they are out at Riverstone as well, as I understand it.
Okay, cool. Wow.
There's a question in the chat from Zachary who said, so either of you, I guess, can answer this one. You said that you can take a few weeks for the frogs to be identified. Do you listen to each recording and identify them manually?
We do. We have looked at artificial intelligence ways of doing it. Nothing is up to snuff yet. And so as it stands now, volunteers and Australian Museum employees, listen to it through headphones and identify the species based on the call and the location. And sometimes it can take a few weeks just if we have a backlog. Sometimes we have thousands of records just being collected every day during like November. And then sometimes it takes an expert. So you want like multiple people to listen to it if it sounds like it could be a threatened species. And so then it just has to get in line to be listened to by more than one person. And so, yeah, it is, it's all being done by humans. We all listen to it and we respond to every submission with unique feedback.
It is quite incredible to think that you do actually listen to all the calls, that there's always someone who's actually listened to them. There's always an effort. There's always usually a comment about it as well. I know because we've had a few talks from FrogID from the Australian Museum, and one of the feedback or suggestions has been, even if it sounds soft, to still give it a recording if it can pop up on the app. Is that like how loud does it have to be for you to pick it up in the app on your end?
It can be quiet because we have our ear tuned to it. If there's a lot of other noise in the foreground, a lot of crickets or cars going by, it can be hard. And then you will get a message back that says, we're sorry, we're not sure if we hear any frogs, or we can't hear it well enough to ID. So you'll know the threshold if you get a message back like that, but we really do try.
Cool. Yeah, Alison?
I was just wondering about the chytrid fungus as well. Because I'm in Hawkesbury-Wires, we've had quite a few reports of the beautiful green tree frogs and dying. They'll come in almost dead and then they're dead within a very short time. There was discussion around whether it was a combination of diseases or what was happening to cause the mass frog deaths. I was wondering if you could give me a bit of an update on how that's been going and if there's been any progression about addressing it, I guess.
Yeah, so Nadia just popped in the chat a conversation article from, I think, 1 or 2 days ago that does give an update on this. But yeah, it's still potentially a combination of factors that are causing this. And we had this last winter, and now it's happening again this winter, potentially worse due to just the rain and the cold, things that can make them more susceptible. And we do definitely want to hear if people are finding dead frogs. We'll pop in the chat an email where you can send any evidence of frog mortality events, because yeah, it is happening now. And we are doing some research and surveys to try and better understand the problem, but it's still undetermined.
Has any breeding programs like that been occurring for the green tree frogs as a backup population, given how big an impact it's been having? Do you know?
I don't think so. I mean, they're still not a listed species, like they're not like endangered, just are one that people see a lot just because they're larger and they seem like more kind of gregarious towards humans, like they don't hide as much. So people do find the green tree frogs dead more than other species, but this mortality event is affecting lots of species too. So I don't know, Nadia, do you know anything about like a captive breeding of green tree frogs?
Not for green tree frogs. It is likely that they're being reported more because, as Maureen said, they are associated with human structures a bit more, and people do see them a lot more than other species. But we are getting reports of even, threatened species popping up sick and dead. So that's really alarming. But again, it's still early days. We're not sure how it's impacting in different frog species. And hopefully we'll be able to share an update with everyone soon, but it's looking a bit sad at the moment, how widespread the scale is.
It's awful. Thank you for all the wonderful work that you do. It's really reassuring when we do the rescues, knowing that your whole team is there just purely focused on frogs. It's excellent.
Well, thank you for keeping an eye and ear out for them. We can't do this important work without everyone's help. So it's really a collective effort. And when we say we mean us and thousands of people across Australia. So it's really, really comforting to know that everyone's on board to help. Thank you so much. I think all the questions were answered in the chat.
Looks like we're wrapping up right on time.
Yeah, any final questions? Anything from you, Catherine?
No, that's all good. I will send an email out with some of the links that were popped in the chat. Last year we did a bit of a wrap-up document after the webinar, and we still got it, so we may as well send that out with a few extra facts that we've learnt today. No, I don't have any other questions. Does anyone else have any last questions or comments that they'd like to add? Awesome. Well, a big thank you to Maureen for presenting this afternoon, and especially as well to Nadia for helping get the afternoon organised. And thanks everyone for joining as well. It's always nice to see some familiar faces and new faces too. That's it. We do, don't forget, I will send a link around. Don't forget, you can become a member if you're not. I think most of you already are on this chat. We do have some other talks coming up that will be in person, but we also have all our webinars from last year during lockdown, which are not publicly available on YouTube, but I will include the links so you can see them all as well. And if there are any other things that you'd like to have a talk about, or you'd like information about, always happy to organise a webinar, whether it's with Australian, with like FrogID or any of the other groups around. So let me know, because I'll organise it if there's interest there. Otherwise, have a lovely evening. Thank you all, and we will see you all again soon.
Thanks so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
See ya.
Thanks for having me. Nice meeting you.
Thank you. It's a great presentation.
Awesome.